Okay, it's 8:05. I think we can get started now. Hello, everybody. My name is Sarms Jabra. I will be moderating this webinar. The subject of this webinar is Refugee Solidarity, a report back from a Diaspora delegation to Greece. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as War Resisters League hosts a report back from members of the Iraqi Transnational Collective who recently returned from working with refugees in Athens, Greece. Today, we're going to be learning about the groups they work with, the ways people there are supporting each other through these tough conditions, and also discuss the role of language diasporas in campaigning here in the US and beyond. So a few housekeeping things. This is War Resisters League's first webinar, so you're on our maiden voyage. Apologies in advance for any tech issues we might have. You'll see on your dialogue screen, there's a chat feature on the right and also a Q&A feature on the bottom taskbar. Use that Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll be collecting those, and at the end of the webinar, we will answer a few of them. A bit about myself. As I said, I'm Sarms Jabra. I'm a member of both the War Resisters League and the Iraqi Transnational Collective, which is likely why I was asked to host this. I'm based in Detroit, Michigan. I'm from Iraq. I am an organizer and strategist here in Detroit. I work for the city of Detroit in their finance department, but beyond that, I volunteer with various organizations, both here locally and abroad. A bit about our panelists. We have three panelists joining us today: Lubna, Vanessa, and Ali. Lubna is a founder and member and central organizer of the Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM, an international body of young Palestinians spanning 33 countries. And in their April 2011 Second International General Assembly in Istanbul, Lubna was elected as the movement's international general coordinator. We also have Vanessa joining us. Vanessa has nearly 15 years of experience as a community organizer and social worker. Very impressive. She loves righteous collective struggle, making Arabic YouTube mixes and warm weather. She's a Palestinian Iraqi American and member of the Iraqi Transnational Collective, currently residing in Atlanta, Georgia. And finally, we have Ali. He is a national field organizer for the War Resisters Leagues, where he co-coordinates the No SWAT Zone campaign to end police militarization, and is the author of Against All Odds, Voices of Popular Struggle in Iraq. He is a member and co-founder of the Iraqi Transnational Collective, and he is based in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. A little bit about War Resisters League, the organization hosting this webinar. War Resisters is a 100-year-old anti-militarist organization working to resist war and its root causes. The War Resisters League affirms that all war is a crime against humanity, and we are determined not to support any kind of war, international or civil, and strive non-violently for the removal of all causes of war, including racism, sexism, and all forms of exploitation. Very good. And finally, the Iraqi Transnational Collective is a group of Iraqis from around the world. We strive to be the progressive voice in the Iraqi world and the Iraqi voice in the progressive world. So for now, I will briefly do a run of show as to what topics will be covered by the speakers. First, we'll hear from Lubna. She's going to give us the context, the big picture, the broader context of the refugee crisis. Vanessa will speak about the work in Greece. And then finally, Ali will continue that conversation about what's been happening in Greece. So from here, I will hand it over to Lubna. Take it away, Lubna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lubna. I am talking to you all today from Riverside, California. It's still bright outside. I know it's getting dark in other places, but I want to thank you all for being here. Thank Ali and Vanessa for joining me on this panel, SARMS for facilitating, for all the people who helped make this webinar possible. I wanted to talk today with a few framing thoughts and a little bit of background context on the question of the conditions of refugees in Greece. But before I start sharing the screen of slides and going into a little bit of the background, I wanted to share a short story with all of you, if you give me a few moments to do so. I think it'll help contextualize a little bit of the experience. I want to start off by saying that the first time that I was in Greece was in February of 2016 of last year. I ended up in Greece working in the refugee camp of Moria camp in the island of Lesbos. And that was because a few months earlier I had traveled to do research for my dissertation to Palestine. Unfortunately, like many other Palestinians in the diaspora, I was denied entry into Palestine for a span of 5 to 10 years. And so I really began to think about the question of our movement and our diaspora in a deeper way, connecting it to the question of other diasporas, because no matter where I was, Jordan, Lebanon, Greece, Turkey, the Palestinian question remains to be a central question in the struggles of other people, but also there's so many more dimensions to Zionism, Zionist violence, and to the Palestinian struggle that became highlighted for me in that experience. So I just wanted to give that for a little context. Okay. So this is Moria refugee camp, February 2016. Quote, "You need to be grateful. A group of Syrian kids gather around the clothing tent situated at the front entrance of the makeshift camp built outside of Moria refugee camp in the Greek island of Lesbos. My body is fully there. I see hundreds of refugees swarming the medical tent, food stations, phone charging kiosk, and the 2 porta potties. I know I am physically there, bundled in all the clothes I could find in the morning, the snowflakes resting on my glove-covered hands, and in my hair reminded me that I'm there, that this is real. But somehow I'm so horrified by the sight, by the chaos and desperation, listening to the murmurs of the refugees who had been there for some time strategizing their exit, listening to the sighs of a Syrian refugee mother who had just arrived drenched from the sinking boats, now painstakingly aware that her 9-year-old daughter might not survive the severe hypothermia she has developed. I stand there, aware that I am there, but distracted by all the thoughts of how this could, yet again, be my people's reality. Hadn't we passed this moment? As a Palestinian, memories of our families settling in camps, fleeing the destroyed ashes of the camp, forced from our lands, denied the right to return, making anew wherever we are, haunts our current realities. But it is not a memory. It is now. It is more now than it was in 1948 or 1967 or 2009. Israel's ban on refugees has lasted 70 years. But I couldn't quite gather how many more people knew what it was like to lose home, knew what it was like to watch your loved ones die en route to the so-called free world, who really knew what it was like to have to beg for clothes and food from a European or American 18-year-old girl who has the discretion of determining whether or not you need a new pair of shoes. Pulled out of my internal thoughts, an 11-year-old tugs at my arm. Ya miss, sa'dini, al-ajnabiyya bidhash ta'tini kundara. That means, oh, miss, please help me. The foreign lady doesn't want to give me a new pair of shoes. Hi, my name is Lubna. I'm the translator working today. This young man would like a pair of shoes. She looks at me. What's wrong with his shoes? I look at him and translate. He says they are too big. They have a hole on the right side. I want one like my brother. He lunges to the floor and points at his brother's boots. I tell her. She looks at the boots. She looks at the boy. No, they are good. She looks to the boy again, points her finger in his face and says, I already told you earlier, you can't have a pair of shoes. You already have a pair. These are for the kids whose shoes are wet from the boats. You need to be grateful. I stared at her, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't an objective translator. I was an advocate for my people, and it was my duty to lend my perfect English and my American cultural capital to them for support. I took the boy by the hand and walked to the back of the tent. I walked into the tent. The blonde, blue-eyed volunteers watch me suspiciously. After all, what makes me look so different than the thousands of refugees outside the tent begging for shoes? I spoke. My perfect English oozed out of my mouth. I work here. And with those 3 words, I walked in, grabbed a pair of shoes, walked out, and gave them to the boy. Little did I know there would be a group of 7 of his closest friends waiting at the backside of the tent for me to do the same for them. I did, not because they needed it, but because I knew, as my grandparents and my parents once knew, that for a refugee, that might be the only actual decision these boys make today. It might be the only decision they have made in the last few months or even the last few years. Okay, I wanted to start off with that story, really to give a context to some of the frustrations that I and many of the other volunteers who I had met who were in Greece at the time really felt about the idea of how service providing was taking place. So it'll come in a little bit, it'll become a little bit more clear as I sort of continue speaking about this. So this picture here that's on the screen is of Moria refugee camp. The top of the hill is referred to as Afghan Hill. The bottom, and the reason for that is I was there before the European Union Turkey deal of March 20th, 2016. So at that time, the context of the camp was that every day new boats were arriving from Turkey, and this camp was really a transit camp. So the most the average refugee would stay in the camp was about 3 to 5 nights, sometimes 1 night, sometimes longer if they were having problems with paperwork. But the camp was sort of stratified in terms of how people could access either legal services, humanitarian services, food services, based on nationality and based on different sort of classifications of who technically has access or eligibility to be classified as a refugee and who does not. So the top of the camp was called Afghan Hill because that's where Afghan refugees were sent to upon arrival. The bottom is where this entrance at the very bottom of the picture is where most Iraqi and Syrian refugees would enter into the camp. So today, when we talk about the refugee context, we're not talking about something that's only impacting Greece. We're not talking about something that's only pertaining to Syrian refugees. It is a global refugee, I'm not even comfortable calling it a crisis, but it's a global, global crisis of people being displaced and pushed out of their homes. The leading causes, as many of you probably already know, is war and military siege and occupation, the global economic crisis, particularly in the aftermath of 2008, climate change, the militarization of borders and of borderlands, the catastrophe that's befalling Syria today, and it's caused sort of a condition where there is approximately 59 million displaced people worldwide, the highest number that we've seen in the last minimum 100 years in human history. In Greece, there are typically 3 different types of ways that people are classified. The first is a refugee or an asylum seeker. Now, technically, by international law standards, all people have the right to seek political asylum. So all people have the right to arrive to a different country and to be able to seek political asylum. However, many of these people are actually being denied the right to go to the countries in which they're trying to seek asylum in. So there's become different classifications. People now eligible for refugee or asylum, people who are classified predominantly as economic migrants, and Palestinian refugees. One of the reasons why I put the Palestinian refugees in a different category is because all of the world's refugees fall under the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, which is that picture that's shown right there. That is the international body that is responsible for safe passage routes, for assistance, humanitarian aid for all of the world's refugee population. However, the Palestinian refugees, we have our own institution called UNRWA, and many of the Palestinian refugees who are arriving to countries in Europe, for example, cannot access UNRWA services or offices. So it puts them in a particularly different kind of position, not necessarily more or less vulnerable, because I think vulnerability is across the board impacting all of the different communities impacted. But there are different ways that they are, that these human beings are being classified and treated. And the reason why I do find this important to mention is that it ends up really becoming the arbiter of how people are treated when they're in a place like Greece. Before the EU-Turkey deal of March of 2016, many of these different classifications determine who had access to sleep in an inside, like IKEA box type setting, and who didn't, who had access to have get a backpack or a sleeping bag or a blanket, and who didn't. So these are different legal statuses, but they are also arbiters of how humanitarian aid and how services are being distributed. And so it puts certain groups who are not classified as refugees or asylum seekers in more vulnerable positions, especially in a place like Greece. When I was there, the only 4 groups who were eligible to get their authorization card as a refugee were Libyans, Iraqis, Afghan, and Syrian communities. So many of the other refugees who were coming from Central Africa, from North Africa, from Iran, they were not necessarily being given the quality of services and aid that the others were. Again, I think it's important to note that when I was there in February of last year, Greece was a very different location, and Vanessa and Ali are going to be speaking more to what the EU-Turkey deal did in terms of policy as well as the changes. But one of the things that is important is that at that time it really was a transit place. So I think one of the things that's important is many of the refugees who arrived to Greece think that finally, once they made it to Greece, that the hardest part of their journey is over, that they've survived the hardest roads and the hardest areas to get through, that they've survived the boats that they've heard have been sinking, and that most of them have experienced being either attacked by coast guards or sinking. And then they finally get to Greece thinking that it's over and not really very aware that the road is actually very long ahead of them and is actually very difficult and still dangerous. So thinking about the actual trips of the refugees, they can take months, they can take years. Many of them lose loved ones along the way. And this is not, the other thing that's important about this is that this is not new. Refugee routes have been coming through Central Africa up through North Africa for the last 25 years. There's not a lot of attention paid to it. There's not a lot of attention paid to how many boats have actually been sinking and how many people have really died in these passages. It hasn't been until more recently, when refugees have been making it into places like Greece and Turkey and Germany and Sweden, that there's been a little bit more global attention to these particular conditions. So these are just some pictures from the Greek island of Lesbos. That picture in the middle is the makeshift camp that used to exist outside of Moria refugee camp. That land was lent by a very kind Greek man who did not want to see the refugees ineligible for accessing the official camp sleeping on the street. So he gave this land to a group of amazing volunteers who created this makeshift camp. And many of the North African, Iranian young single men would be sleeping in this camp outside, so they weren't staying outside in the mountains during the winter. So as many of you probably know, I'm sure that many of you who are on this phone have been following a little bit of the coverage regarding the conditions for refugees, especially in a place like Greece. After the European Union Turkey deal, which ultimately it blocked all refugee routes from Turkey to Greece, and it also basically trapped the thousands of refugees who were in Greece. It basically closed the borders with Macedonia, but they also couldn't go back through the routes that they came from. So there have been thousands of refugees languishing in Greece for over a year now. And many of the conditions that existed before have become intensified extraordinarily. Child detention, you have many child refugees who are alone, who are being detained by Greek authorities, by their private security agencies, who live in these child detention centers that are really like prisons, with soaring rates of mental health struggles, of physical health struggles, really chronic conditions, the lack of proper aid and resources, the lack of proper service models and volunteers. Many of the service providers who exist are through the large nonprofit organizations who have volunteers that can't even speak to the refugees in their native languages. So that's one of the very first problems. The second is that many of these volunteers have not been trained in cultural sensitivity and culturally relevant services. And third is that many of these volunteers have absolutely no political context of the experience of these refugees, both while being inside of the camps or inside of the detention centers, but also previously. So the real context of what those death trips look like, the real context of what kind of political violence, what kind of genocides, what kind of conditions they're fleeing from is really not fully known. The next thing is policing and containment. So the Greek authorities, particularly in that period of when I was there in January, February, March 2016, really started to intensify the sort of containment and police repression of the refugee populations. Part of that was because they were being threatened by the European Union for not, for the European Union to have measures taken against them for not doing more to secure their borders. So the Greek authorities really started cracking down, started hiring private companies. Companies like Frontex was there last year, which does most of the security screenings for the refugees, and is very sort of traumatic security screenings. Today we have G4S, which is the primary security screening company operating in the Greek islands. The very, very slow bureaucratic stalemate in political asylum process. They have quotas for how many people they were willing to take. So it's very difficult and very expensive and very hard to access. Sex and human trafficking and gendered and sexual violence, chronic health crisis, including mental health. And of course, because of the scarcity, refugees are existing within this broader context of a politics of scarcity, ongoing violence, ongoing repression, severe struggles with mental health after, all that they have already been through, severe forms of trauma and PTSD, the interracial and interethnic and sectarian divisions and tensions have really intensified in Greece. Mostly because, when people are denied sort of basic resources and basic freedoms, we all know that a lot of people can fight over sort of crumbs of the pie in some ways. So there's a lot of resentment that gets built up. And what's even worse is that the global media really last several months ago, when there was a huge sort of uprising of the refugees up against the Greek authorities in Moria refugee camp in Lesvos, the global media spun it as these, scary, dangerous, violent refugees who were fighting the European government and who were fighting each other, Arabs and Afghans fighting each other because, they're just inherently dangerous. And there was really no analysis about the sort of broader political, economic, social conditions and experiences of what people are going through there. So I'm gonna close by, I feel like that's enough of a background. I know that Ali and Vanessa will sort of build out of that and talk more about their recent delegation. But I do want to talk about two things. When I came back from this trip, myself and a couple other PY members who had been on been working in Greece as well, we were having this discussion about our struggles in political movement work. especially when it came to the question of Syria and how to work out the sort of how to work out like an ethical analysis and position on Syria in the context of a very, very divided left. And one of the things that had really become clear to us, though much has still yet to become clear to us regarding that, but one of the things that became very clear to us is that on the one hand, we are seeing all of this political movement work happening across the world, all of this left political movement work happening across the world that's really lost its sense of commitment to service, to the survival of the people. And I think that there's a rightful reason for that in some ways. On the one hand, service is critical and is dire and is important, but on the other hand, it's become so co-opted by these larger institutions, the larger nonprofit organizations, the international community, international law, which has really sort of implemented this white savior complex vision or lens into service, and really sort of developed entire industries and businesses of profit that's basically profiting off of human catastrophe. And so a lot of left critical political movement thinkers and organizers have some sort of pushback against that idea of service, because it sort of manifests these very neoliberal ideals and very Western imperialist, imperial intervention ideals. So that's one of the critiques there. On the other hand, is what I said about service work is that there's completely no background, context, political framework, or guiding vision that understands the service and survival of the people as part and parcel of broader liberation movement building, broader liberation organizing. And that was something that we in PYM have been feeling for quite a long time. So we really wanted to find a way to do work where we could lend our own cultural capital where needed to support the survival of our people, to make sure they get their basic needs, to make it through the day. And that we felt we could do that in a way that others who don't have our cultural backgrounds or our political backgrounds or even our language backgrounds could, especially after seeing like the inundation of so many volunteers in Greece who just couldn't even have a sit down conversation with many of the refugees. So that was sort of the two ideas, like really pushing back against this idea that movement work didn't include service, and pushing up against the idea that service work should be dominated by the nonprofit industrial complex and by a lot of ideals that really replicate an imperialist intervention for us. So we started to work a little bit more on sending more volunteers to Greece, as well as developing and strengthening a refugee support program here in San Diego, California, as well as organizing our own sort of political education circles to understand Syria, Arab dictatorship, violence, imperialism in our region in more in-depth ways. And one of the things as a sort of start off point that we came off with is having the 4 dimensions be the guiding principles guiding our political framework for our service working in Greece. The first as the transnational dimension, that we are a transnational movement. We don't necessarily believe that we have a loyalty or an obligation to people within the nation states that we live in, more so than the global community. And we really wanted to work against this privileging and this privileging of nationalism in a way that it sort of becomes ethnocentric and becomes sort of part and parcel of like a global imperialist world order. The second is the refugee dimension. So Palestinian refugees are very critical central stakeholders and visionaries and strugglers in the Palestinian movement. And we as PYM have learned so much from the members of our movement who are refugees, who grew up in the refugee camps. We find them to be some of the most innovative, really critical political organizers. And so for us, thinking about refugees being the agents of transformative change, them being the sort of leaders of change, and figuring out a way that we could just support that. So not coming to claim to speak on behalf of them or to work for them, but to actually figure out a way that we could support their agency as refugees. The third was the Arab and regional broader dimension. So really thinking more deeply about how Palestine and the Palestinian struggle is not only about the small fractions of Palestinian land that we talk about today, and it's not only about the Palestinian people, both who live under occupation in the homeland or who are scattered transnationally, but it was about the impact of Zionism in the broader region. And that could be probably another webinar in and of itself, but the historical role of Zionist repression and warfare, destabilizing the region, and being part and parcel of this entire sort of catastrophe is really critical. And what's more is that realizing how much Israeli propaganda tries to whitewash that kind of destruction by putting out these rescue missions and humanitarian missions in places like Greece or in Sudan or in Ethiopia or in Haiti, really was something that agitated us. And so for us, it wasn't about like, oh, we as Palestinians need to be there to show that we're better than the Israelis, but it was about us really needing to work with our natural partners to really think about how Zionism is not just hurting Palestinians, but is hurting all of our communities. And then the fourth is the nonprofit industrial complex, the rights-based approach, and international law, three things that are always assumed to help people in need who are suffering, but in many times and cases are actually exploiting us and are actually building industries in order to, very large industries profiting off of us. And the last, which I spoke of, is how do we think of service meeting politics? How do we think of a different kind of politics? So we can maybe revisit some of these ideas towards the end of this discussion. I do want to go over pretty quickly what kinds of things can be done for the people who are on the webinar. First, you can go to Greece to offer services, and you could speak with us about what that work would look like now. The second is advocating for Syrian refugee student scholarships and faculty hires at universities. Books Not Bombs is doing this work, and we are asking for people who have connections with student organizations or with faculty to really support Books Not Bombs in this work. The third is advocating for increased refugee resettlement in the US with local elected officials and senators and congressional representatives. We probably know that they're not going to listen to us, especially now with all the changes that have happened in the last couple months, but this is something we want to continue to build as a campaign. Then to condemn the Trump executive order and to strengthen sanctuary city campaigns, as well as refugee resettlement programs. Sorry, that's a typo. Fundraise for small organizations who make bigger impact. Talk to Swana Connect, ITC, and PYM for references. So the big organizations, a lot of the money that you're donating probably won't make it down to the ground. So talk to us for the best organizations for fundraising. And then the continued activism to end the militarization of all borders and all forms of imperialism in our region. Activism that's genuinely anti-Zionist, working to end Zionist violence, green, pink, and whitewashing in Palestine and the region in Greece, Haiti, Sudan, and globally. Activism that ends the stigmatization, surveillance, containment, and criminalization of refugees in Europe, but especially in the United States, because that's where we are. And really needing to do the work to enhance and uplift Syrian refugee and other refugee narratives through political education. And not just sort of speaking on behalf of the refugees and just trying to make it into a humanitarian situation without any kind of acknowledgement of the role of the Bashar al-Assad regime and the role of all of the many different political forces on the ground that should be held accountable with their nation state backing countries who are creating the catastrophe in Syria and in Iraq and in many other places. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lubna. That was very interesting to hear. As someone who's familiar with what's going on, but not much, it's really beneficial to hear what you have to say, and commend you for the work that you've done. Speaking of work, next up, we have Vanessa, who is going to talk about some of the work that she did on the recent delegation. So I'll take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So my name is Vanessa Faraj. I'm a member of the Iraqi Transnational Collective, and I'm really thrilled to be on the line with everyone tonight. First of all, I want to offer gratitude to our comrade Lubna for the analysis that she just provided us with I think we can all agree that it's of the utmost importance that we ground our conversation with an understanding of the geopolitical forces that create these alleged crises in the first place. So before I dive into our work in Athens, I want to reiterate one of the points that Lubna made, and then provide another, guiding framework that really helped ground our delegation and ground our time in Athens. So when ITC was presented with an opportunity to plan a delegation to Greece, we attended an orientation webinar led by Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM, and Swana Connect. And Swana Connect is an organization based in Los Angeles that organizes delegations such as the one that we went on, and stands for Southwest Asia Northern African Connect. And so in that orientation, PYM offered a really critical frame for the initiative that by articulating the value and importance of movement work and the value and importance of direct service work, while also recognizing that oftentimes political organizing isn't able to or fails to meet the direct needs of people living under the boot of an oppressive system, while conversely, direct service oftentimes will meet immediate need of an individual, but with no political analysis or vision that actually seeks to transform the system that created that need in the first place. And so one of the things that really inspired me to join this delegation was that these delegations actually seek to combine both of these change methodologies for even more powerful and stronger work that can happen in movement work alone or in direct service work alone. I also want to articulate that I believe that there was, and I should actually back up a little bit to say that our delegation took place through the end of February, beginning of March. We were there for about 12 days. It was myself, Ali, and then another woman, Canadian Iraqi woman. And we, offered a variety of interpretation assistance while we were there, interpretation help while we were there. And so I think there was tremendous strength and value of our delegation, just as Arabs living in diaspora, living in isolation from our own homelands, as people who are either refugees ourselves or children of refugees who have been helplessly watching continued death and destruction in Syria, and that going to Athens really offered us a concrete way to work with our brothers and sisters who had fled a living nightmare in their homelands and were met with another living nightmare in Greece. And then also the importance of our trip, I would say, wasn't simply by virtue of the fact that of our identity, or by the fact that we were able to provide concrete Arabic language and interpretation skills, but I think we also were able to bring a political analysis that of course rejects the paternalistic and racist notion that refugees are passive victims that need to be saved, but instead puts forward a philosophy and an approach that says that my liberation is bound in yours, and let's work together to that end. So to that end, I'm going to share my screen with you all. So just give me just a moment, because I want to talk a little bit about the actual work that we did. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the various housing options that were available for refugees that were in Athens. And as Lubna articulated, following the EU-Turkey deal, folks were essentially stuck in Greece. What had originally been considered the first point on people's journey to Western Europe really ultimately have left people in a city and in a country that lacks the infrastructure and the political will, I would argue, to address people's needs in a way that allows them to build a life for themselves in Athens. So there's three main types of housing that's offered to refugees. The first is refugee camps. There's large government-funded refugee camps. At the time of creating this presentation, there were 5 official camps that existed. There's also apartments and hotel rooms funded by different NGOs. And then given Greece's own economic crisis, there's a great deal of abandoned buildings in Athens. And so in addition to the UN camps and to the apartments and the hotel rooms that are funded by the NGOs, there's community-funded refugee camps, otherwise known and commonly called squats, that are started by local Greek volunteers and refugees in the community. And so squats are essentially, they're abandoned buildings that are taken over by Greek nationals that are turned into housing for refugees and for migrants. So people literally will occupy the building. They'll see if anyone shows up. If no one shows up, they turn the building into housing quarters. And so there are currently over 11 of them in and around Exarchia. And Exarchia is considered the anarchist capital of Athens.
Vanessa, sorry,
yeah.
Are you trying to share your screen? Because we can't see it if you are.
Oh, no? Okay. Oh, thanks for telling me.
Sure. I was waiting for a moment to jump in. It's very interesting what you're saying. I want to see these housing places. Okay. Okay. You're good now.
How am I now?
Good.
Okay, great. All right, so let's actually scoot back a little bit. So back to the first type of housing that's offered. So this is an example of some of the refugee camps that are offered. There are currently about 5 camps, and this is Skaramagas camp that's, and Skaramagas is a port town that's just a little bit west of Athens. So these are literally containers that people are living in. And so then we also have squats. And just to go back a little bit, squats are abandoned buildings that are taken over by Greek nationals that they turn into housing for refugees and for migrants. And so the pictures on your left-hand side are some of the living quarters of one of the squats, and then some of the, some of the ways in which people are drying their laundry. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a sign that says, "From Standing Rock to Greece, throw back the tear gas, choke the police." And it's possible that y'all have already seen this sign and around social media. So there's definitely a very strong anti-state and anti-police sentiment and approach to refugee communities that are in Athens in the specific neighborhood of Exarchia. And so while the squats are wrought with a lot of problematic forces and elements, learning about them and working inside of them, I think really helped to expand our own imagination about what, so to speak, third space infrastructure that we would need even in the US to help work alongside folks that are living on the most extreme margins of American society as well. And so there are a lot of people that said that the police were forbidden from entering Exarchia. Other folks said that they sometimes would come and go as they pleased, but there was definitely a very strong sentiment that the police were not welcome in this specific neighborhood. So now I want to talk a little bit about the actual work that we did. There were 3 organizations, or actually 4 organizations that we worked with. I'm going to focus my talk on 2 specific organizations. And these are some more pictures of some of the squats as well, and some of the sleeping and living conditions under which people were living. So we worked at the 5th School Squat and at Amortel. And so Amortel kind of definitely falls more into the category of a service delivery organization. Amortel is an international NGO that works specifically with women in areas of crisis. They offered pre- and postnatal services for pregnant women and new mothers, and served Arabic and Kurdish-speaking Syrians, Farsi-speaking Afghans, and English-speaking West Africans. And so the interpretation that I provided there was for intake processes, ultrasounds and checkups for pregnant women, and then new infant checkups as well. They also offered breastfeeding consultations, but they have an in-house paid interpreter who works there, and so she was offering those. So Amortel was an international NGO that very quickly set up shop in a very beautiful, and as you can see, very well-lit apartment in Athens. And then if you compare that to the Fit School squat, there really was just a very dramatic difference. So the Fit School squat was in part founded by a Syrian Greek man. The squat itself housed over 300 people who were essentially stuck in Greece. Myself, Ali, and Shok had the honor of attending one of their assemblies that was in Arabic, Kurdish, Greek, and then a little bit of English. And the assemblies were these incredibly messy, very beautiful, I would say in some ways collective and other ways authoritarian processes where residents of the squat came together to talk about issues that the squat was facing, talk about different proposals that people wanted to, suggest for how to improve the living conditions in the squat, and then vote on those proposals. And so we had the opportunity to attend one of those assemblies and propose a specific project to start a refugee-run early childhood education program that wouldn't be dependent on volunteers who, of course, are transient and unreliable by nature, but would instead be run by the refugees, women and men who were actually living in that specific squat. And I want to end my section with a quote, and then I'm going to pass the baton to Ali. And let me do screen share one more time. Can you guys see that quote?
Yep.
So I think this quote really speaks to the ways in which people feel very stuck, even though this was from someone who was on one of the islands. But he says, in Syria, when you die, you know that you will die just one time, but you will die between your memories. You will die between your families, your relatives. But here we are just waiting. You ask me for 6 or 7 months, you should wait, wait, and wait. We are waiting for nothing. We don't know why we are waiting or what will happen to us. And so I think that quote really speaks to the ways in which folks that were still in Athens felt like they weren't quite sure where they were to go next, because they certainly didn't think that their journey was going to end in Athens. And so with that, go ahead, Ali.
Take it actually from here. Thank you, Vanessa, for that. Just a few housekeeping things. I see there's a few people joining us by phone. If you're joining us by phone and want to text questions, you can text them to one of our staff members over at War Resisters League. The number is 917-971-2498, and I'll type that in just a moment here as well. For anyone who wants to ask a question from a computer, I'm going to share my screen briefly to show you how to do that. Oh, okay, so you see up here, there's a Q&A button. If you click on that, you can ask a question. When you're not sharing a screen, that will be on the bottom of your screen around here. So just something for everyone to see if they want to ask any questions. If something comes up for any of the speakers, you can address your question to a specific speaker, or you can ask it generally. And with that, I will turn it over to Ali to,
Okay, cool. Thank you, Sarms. Can everybody hear me? All right. So thank you, first of all, to everybody that put this webinar together. There's a lot of behind the scenes work happening, I know. And then also, of course, to Lubna and Vanessa for kind of setting the ground for what I want to share with you all. But also, I'm going to try to maybe be brief so we can have more time to kind of discuss the implications of all these things. So like Vanessa mentioned, I went with the Iraqi Transnational Collective Delegation in late February and early March. And I want to talk a little more about some of the groups that we worked with, and specifically I spent most of my 12 days trying to support. Why those groups I think are unique and kind of like Lubna said, are different than I think, what the great majority of people imagine when they're practicing refugee support or solidarity. And then finally, what all that could mean for diaspora organizing, aid work, and the anti-war and anti-militarist movements, which I think are very connected. So I will now try to share a screen. And let's see what happens when I try to do that. Okay, I think that's shared. Sorry, but it's not presenting there. Okay. Sorry for the delay here. Okay, I think it's shared now. Possibly. Is it shared? Arms.
Yeah.
Give me a sign. Okay, thank you. Right. So the first organization that I actually arrived a little before Vanessa and Shok, a couple days before that I got to know, was one called Coro. And Coro is kind of an interesting hybrid. It's a cooperative drop-in center that, as far as I understood, was founded in the UK to meet kind of the most immediate needs of refugees that were in and around Athens. Like Vanessa mentioned, almost all of our work was in the neighborhood of Exarchia, and we were staying nearby in Victoria. So this drop-in center was in Exarchia and provided all kinds of different immediate services. So there was a cafeteria for people that wanted to get some lunch, that brought with it a kitchen and a lot of cooking projects. There was dental care, there was daycare, and then there was a legal clinic. And true to this sign, which was up on one of the walls there, it was really kind of all the languages of Swana, or the Middle East, were represented. I talked to people from Balochistan, Syria, Morocco, Algeria, Iran, Pakistan, and on and on.
Ali, sorry to interrupt. We're still just on the first slide.
Oh no, the first slide? How can that be? Thank you for interrupting me, actually.
Of course.
But what slide is this? Did it change?
No, it's still the first slide.
Okay, sorry about that, y'all. This world of technology is it's so powerful when you can use it, but then when you don't, it's like embarrassing and awkward, I think. Share screen. Hold on. I think, okay, just 1 second. Okay, so what slide appears now?
The statement by the hunger strikers.
Right. So here is a slide that says Coro, perhaps. Okay. So right. So it was a place of many languages, and that in some ways had kind of a diaspora vibe, in the sense of sort of Iranian and British people were volunteering there, but they were mostly volunteers from Europe. So they deeply appreciated our presence as interpreters, calling us gold dust. So a couple times I interpreted for their legal clinic, and specifically there was a person called, let's call him, since we got to protect the names here, called Adil from Algeria, who had just arrived from the islands, kind of didn't have housing support and the meds that he needed. So the legal clinic was trying to problem solve that, since services from the state and from various aid organizations were really slow, and this person needed immediate help. So there's I think value in a place like Coro, especially for us. We ended up raising money and distributing it to various groups, and the money we gave to Coro, they right away turned around and used it to hire interpreters, because language was such a sore need, especially Urdu and Dari, and languages, including but not limited to Arabic. So you can follow Coro here. Their Facebook page is very active. And another way that it's important is they give updates on news. So for example, here, just this past late April, there was a hunger strike by Syrian Kurds on the islands, and then they kind of broadcast their demands on their Facebook page. That was actually also a day before, tragically, a boat sank. Though not many boats, like Lubna was saying, are still arriving or can't. There are some that go through, and perhaps a dozen people passed a day after this message was written. So moving on from Coro, I'd like to go further into the fifth school, which Vanessa had mentioned, and which Shouq, who couldn't join us today, but was very key to our delegation and driving it, volunteered with me on, which was the kind of early childhood education center. So this graffiti, by the way, Exarchia is very well known for its ubiquitous graffiti everywhere, and that kind of fuses with like Arabic calligraphy and various messages. And so this is on the way to the fifth school in Exarchia, which is Ya Mazlum Irtah, like oh, oppressed one, like rest, or it's actually a line from a popular Egyptian song that was very fitting to people's lives. So this is the basement of the fifth school, which you can see had been set up kind of as like a play learning center. And the reason why it was so important for us to try to, as Vanessa said, like help mothers and refugees there lead this process and place is because, you know, refugees have many things going on in their lives, and it was hard to manage that while also having a place where young children before first grade, since they're actually mandated in Greece to go to Greek school, have a place for them to play. So this is the basement room, and we actually adapted a curriculum that Vanessa introduced us to from a school in Nablus in Palestine that was Arabic and English. And that was very fitting to kind of this particular situation that maybe people could take on after our short visit. So here we are sitting in that same basement center. And here is one of the exercises. These are some of the young people that we had the chance to work with. Yeah, and it was, you know, I think also kind of a deep honor and joy to meet these young people and kind of, you know, be of use to them and their budding intelligence. Here we are playing some. But beyond the fifth school, which is very complex and like Vanessa said, had this assembly process, and the squats in general really vary in their conditions and things going on in them. There's one person we met from another squat who told us that she really appreciated that we were there to do things like try to set up this preschool education center or interpret, but what we should really be doing is broadcasting people's demands and try to use our giant Western microphones to amplify what people wanted to say. So I wanted to share that, since that was around a squat situation, which was very different than the other kind of requests that we got. And that quote is from someone that's called Nejwa, who's from El Hasaka, which is in northeast Syria, mostly Kurdish-speaking region, who said that she saw another Syria in Greece, a miniature Syria. There's no justice here. Despite all this, we're trying to let this phase pass, to be patient so we can leave. And then she describes kind of more deeply that the Syrian uprising and revolution, we were played because we wanted the simplest of our rights, like freedom, to live like anyone else on this planet. Big industrial countries are playing a political game. We are pawns in that game, so the wealthy countries and arms dealers of the world can benefit. The revolution should have happened, but we were exploited. And finally, she says to us directly, me and Shouq, who are interviewing her, we want you to amplify our voices, saying, stop exploiting us, stop these countries' games with us. We want our rights. Whoever has humanity within them, pressure your governments to stop manipulating our futures. So I thought that was an important message that she wanted us to pass, but then also has implications for how we might, like everybody's saying, imagine sort of a fusion between immediate needs and larger political work. I'd like to just close then by going to the last group that we interacted with, which is Jafra. So Jafra was a very inspiring collection of 7 to 8 refugee folk from Yarmouk, which is a mostly Palestinian refugee camp near Damascus. So these are twice displaced people who are connected to other projects called Jafra, but this is specifically the Greek one. And they were just really inspiring to us because they were all in their 20s. They were really kind of energized from having organized people's demands on the islands. Those really rough conditions that Lubna was mentioning, they were key in trying to agitate for a difference in those conditions. So when they arrived in Athens, they started various projects right away, such as one of them had been a baker, so distributing bread to the various squats and places where people needed it, imagining, how to deal with kind of the trauma of war and different kind of workshops and empowering things that they were really fitted to address since they themselves were refugees, and other kinds of support, but driven by this idea of like refugee to refugee, which was really inspiring to imagine kind of the self-organization that you could support, and the ideas that like the way beyond paternalism that represented. So here's a little bit about Jafra, their vision, their Facebook page, and I thought it was really deep how Noor, who's kind of an exciting leader within Jafra, talked about the micro-society that refugee communities represent, saying we have doctors, bakers, and activists among us, we have an entire society. So that they really kind of had a lot of the things they needed to advocate for themselves, support each other, which is, in some ways the opposite of how, let's say, like fundraisers for refugees are framed. And we thought it was very important to highlight there. So in conclusion, I think, clearly this trip was really brief, but, it really emphasized for me, and I think all of us in ITC and beyond, how there's not just the message that refugees aren't criminals or terrorists, which is probably obvious to us, but also that there's genuine self-organizing happening, and that there's real analysis, like Nejwa's, of their conditions, of what caused their displacement, and then we could take that analysis and work as a starting point. Also, beyond those specific 3 projects I mentioned, there were many others that weren't as concrete, but were really, I think, like ways to imagine how future diaspora delegations or other groups that want to help go further in creating or co-creating certain initiatives. So just briefly to mention, for example, this is a newspaper project called Badoon Watan, which in Arabic and Dari means without a nation. And it's in Arabic, Dari, and English. And like this was a project by kind of some anarchist activists to hand out news of like refugee organizing and resistance, as well as like various kinds of news about Facebook, about sending information to get out of Greece, and a way to provide kind of a flow of information that was, I thought, pretty innovative and used many languages. There was also a moment during our 5th school visit and early childhood education time when a mom named Nasreen was kind of like, yeah, it's good to have this in Arabic now, and people are learning German or English or Greek in school, but like, what about our kids' relationship to like their own culture, to Syria that they had to flee? Is there any way that people are a little, like you could say, us people that are much longer in our diasporas, which are not usually quite the same and a result of war, have this disconnect between what they see on the news, the reason that they're there, and also just lacking some of the basic like language and cultural knowledge to make that connection. So based on that comment from Mom, others that were there were like, what would it mean to have, for example, an Arabic language or other languages of refugees cultural center that wouldn't just be about immediate needs, but kind of this deep intercultural work about like rootedness and developing analysis of young people who are, of course, going to grow up and possibly be leaders. And then I think finally too, just how like diaspora collectives like Iraqi Transnational Collective, like PYM, like some that we're in contact with, such as Afghans United for Justice or Syrian Solidarity Collective, can play a role in in like leading how to think about refugee solidarity. And since like Vanessa was saying, watching from a distance has been very painful for a lot of us. And these trips, I think, help us like to get closer to the ground, to feel like we're useful, even if we might not be. And it's kind of about us there. But then how do we bring that like real contact back to anti-war organizing, back to people that are thinking about these issues and are somewhat like distant from the realities there, distant from what's happening in Syria, distant from what people are thinking and bringing and what they actually want, and that their demands we could amplify. So I'll stop there and just welcome everybody's conversations, and to mention that that because of this delegation and Swana Connects and PYM's leadership, WRL specifically is planning on supporting a similar delegation in the late summer and fall. So we'd love to hear from people that might want to join that or support it, since we're going to be kind of hoping to work in collaboration with future delegations from all these diaspora organizations we mentioned. And thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you all panelists for your, not just your work, but your time here today to talk about your experiences, your well-crafted PowerPoints, your, and just being yourselves. It's really inspiring to hear what you all have to say, and educational and motivating, because as Lubna sort of highlighted, it's a very difficult situation over there right now, but there are organizations who are providing real value and who are, really supporting people in a way that is not exploitative. And for me personally, it was really helpful or just empowering to hear the words of the refugees themselves. The quotes you provided were interesting. So we want to remind everyone, if you do have questions, we will welcome them now. We have one question here asking, speaking of future delegations, what languages are most needed for those delegations? I'll leave that to any of you all to answer.
The question is what languages are most needed?
Mm-hmm.
I would say Arabic, Kurdish, and Farsi for sure would be the three top languages that come to mind.
Okay. Well, we got a few more questions coming in now. This question is for Lubna. Lubna, you talked about the disconnect at times between political and service work. Can you elaborate more on how on the political organizing front, we can take more seriously the immediate need of our people to just survive while we continue the fight for liberation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really complicated question, depending on what kind of organization you are, where you're working, where your base is. If you're, are you a membership-based organization? Are you a nonprofit that's restricted by government funding? So there's a lot of questions that go into play. I'm someone who has done most of my political grassroots organizing work through PYM. But I also, before coming back to school, I worked for 8 years at the Arab Cultural and Community Center in San Francisco, which wasn't a very political organization. We were a cultural center, we had after-school youth programs, and we did social services and domestic violence and refugee support work. And for most of those 8 years, while I was in PYM and working at the ACC, I had always been told on the service, like on the ACC end, by many people, by board members, by funders, like, keep politics out of this. Like, Lubna, we respect you, but you're going to jeopardize the funding. You know, Zionists don't want you to be doing Palestine work with government funding. Keep the politics out of it. You might be upsetting some people in our community. And I always felt like there was something very strange about that, because it's not that the center was completely apolitical. It's just that by not taking politics, we all know you take a certain type of political use to speak out about certain things, but not others. You are taking a political stand. But on the other hand, when I was working within a space like PYM, I found that, like, how do you do social service work when you are a grassroots organization that does not have paid staff, when you struggle financially, when you are a transnational movement, your membership is scattered all over the place. It's really hard to sort of even figure out how to do, like, how to like do a collective process envisioning things together. So I think on a general level, it really depends on the kind of organizational models we have. And I think we as communities who are committed to the survival of our communities really need to rethink social service, and we really need to also rethink politics that are theoretical or academic or just so discourse based. And I think that's getting harder and harder and harder in the kind of world that we live in, especially because there's such a conflation between like what is movement work and like social media activism or like discourse activism. Like, I'm gonna write this letter and that's my activism today. So I don't really have the answer, but those are just some of my thoughts. I don't know if Vanessa and Ali, you have some ideas about that specific thing. I was speaking more broadly.
I can repeat the question
the Greece
to
work.
Vanessa and Ali, if you all would like me to. I'm seeing some hands.
To answer the question.
Yeah, I can repeat the question if you.
Oh, it's okay. We have it in front of us. Yeah.
Yes, you do. Okay.
I mean, I think this is a question that I think a lot of organizers have been asking for quite some time. One that I definitely toss around a lot, and I think one of the ways that I try to weave service into organizing work is not to think of direct service as separate from organizing, but ultimately to think of it as a base building tool. You know, and I think the common example that's used is, you know, the ways in which the Black Panther Party, you know, used direct services or used the free lunch program to recruit people to their party. But I think that it can, if there's like a direct need that you're meeting, and I think within the US, that can, if you're working with, you know, refugee communities or Arab communities, that can very well be transportation services to doctor's appointments, interpretation services, help navigating, food stamps or, utility assistance applications. And then through that direct service, then bringing people through some sort of political education process that then will, you know, get them more bought into a larger political program. But that I think that to me, the service work has to be within the context of an organizing framework. Otherwise, it's exactly as Lubna's articulated, really just service for the sake of service, which of course lacks a little bit of vision, for sure.
Are there anything to add, or?
Sure, yeah, I mean, briefly, I think they covered the most important points in my mind, but I think one interesting phenomenon we saw too is, you know, how in the US, I think rightly, there's a lot of emphasis on impacted people leading political work and organizing. And in Europe, I learned, because I actually had never been to Greece, there was a really different scene. So we would sit there and talk to like people from Jafra, and remember that when we were there, it was almost exactly a year after the EU-Turkey deal. So there were a lot of like protests planned. We saw flyers and stuff. It's like, you know, march against this oppressive deal. And we'd ask, like, the refugees were meeting, are y'all involved in these protests? And they'd be like, yeah, we're gonna be involved, but, you know, we kind of can't do that organizationally. Or that might, you know, jeopardize some of the relationships we have, but we'll march along with people. And I wondered if the demands of the march were coming from the refugees, since they're the ones who would be affected by it. And they were like, no, that's like coming out of the Communist Party or this political Greek formation that they would name. So like the question of them providing leadership in service in Greece for other refugee communities didn't seem to connect to them leading, organizing around their exact issues. So like even if people feel that they don't have the time or are able to be visible, there's many ways that their like demands and analysis can inform how we talk about advocacy or other kinds of like deeper movement building. That's really crucial there. So, and then how do we relate to kind of our Greek or German or British like counterparts who are dealing with the refugee crisis like much more directly, and understand their organizing world and how it relates to the relationships we're building. So those are just some of the things that come to mind.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, moving on to the next question. We have a question from Debbie. She says that this piece around supporting refugee self-organization seems so critical. What other plans does ITC and or WRL or others have to continue to share the stories from this work or this trip and integrate more refugee voices demands into anti-war organizing? And that's a general, actually it's for Ali. She addressed it to you, Ali, so I guess you can have first crack at that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's another big question. I think one name we didn't mention actually, and it'd be nice if we did. It was a friend named Ryan Harvey. Some people might be familiar with him. He's like a musician, organizer based in Baltimore, who had been to Greece once a little over a year before we went, and actually was critical in ITC getting there on this delegation. And he, in his kind of capacity as a journalist, was trying to think about the challenge of how usually kind of like journalists drop in, drop out, and have this extractive relationship to stories and experiences. But at the same time, that like Nejwa was telling us, it'd be kind of a loss not to share all these like crucial perspectives that we're hearing, because the world hears, you know, such different stories about and from refugees in the kind of dominant narrative. So so how can storytelling be kind of co-created with some of the people there, I think is a question. And how Ryan, I think, was really excellent in finding these incredible, compelling stories that are not kind of like romanticizing them, but people that had like swam across to the Greek islands from Turkey, or that were founding their own kind of refugee aid projects. And those are, you know, projects that are kind of just like begging to be turned into media work, turned into like various things that we could maybe try to imagine how to integrate into a larger organizing project. So I'd say check out the work of Ryan Harvey as a start, since it was on our trip that he like put out some of this story gathering. But maybe y'all in other boxes on this panel have clearer ideas.
I'll pass to Lorna.
I think you answered it very well, Ali.
Okay, and we'll keep going. We have a quick question from Emma. How can one support these delegations if they don't have language skills? Are there other ways people can support these trips?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious ways of donating for future delegations of bilingual or multilingual people. But I mean, Ryan, for instance, had been to Greece a number of times and, you know, is a monolingual English speaker, but also was a builder and a construction worker. And so was working on the islands, you know, keeping night watch and, you know, helping to guide boats to the shore. So I think that perhaps if there's concrete skills, like very concrete and as articulated by people in Athens as needing those specific skills, that might be something to offer if someone's interested in going. But I definitely would say that during our time in Athens, definitely was a different moment than 2015 and 2016. And we weren't on the islands. We were inside of Athens, and it definitely took some work and some digging to find exactly where our time could be best spent and best utilized in the short time that we were there. And it definitely seemed like the way in which we entered a lot of the organizations, and the reason we entered so quickly was because of the language skills that we offered. And that it was such a scarcity of bilingual or multilingual volunteers that people, were ready to, have us start volunteering with them literally the second we walked through the door. So in terms of what folks who don't speak any of the needed languages could offer, yeah, I mean, maybe, my co-panelists have other suggestions, but it seems like maybe concrete skills that are needed, and then also, yeah, cash money.
Anything else besides, cream and skills, Lubna or Adi?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, I'm not 100% sure, because I mean, I've been following sort of the work there, working with PYM, but I haven't physically been there since before the EU-Turkey deal. It is fundamentally a different kind of context in terms of how people can function both on the islands and in Athens and other places. But I do want to sort of go back quick to the point of the last screen that the last PowerPoint that I shared about, like, just this like abundance of different types of things that can be done locally. I think that in the context that we're living in now, we're gonna be, experiencing even heightened fudging of the refugee narrative and experience in American media and press. We're going to be experiencing more criminalization of refugee populations here in the United States. The refugee communities who are already here are really not getting the services and support that they need, are living in constant, harassment and threats in the places that they are. So I do think that there's a lot of service and activism and media-based work and like advocacy work that can be done from the United States, in addition to the fundraising and direct service work.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. You don't have to be there to support it. There are ways that you can spread the word and the missions of various organizations. Attending webinars like this, for example, or sharing this recorded webinar with people is one way that you can support the work of the prior delegations and the future delegations that will go to build on that work. I believe Ali has a question, so we'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, thank you. Sarms, this question is for you, to be honest.
I wasn't told that I'd be answering questions.
Yeah, keep you on your toes. You live in Detroit, which is a special place in many ways, but it's also kind of like the general zone of a huge Arabic language speaking diaspora. So I wondered if, like Lubna is saying, just have you had much experience with like refugee resettlement in Detroit, and have seen how that's interacting with political work more generally?
Seeing how it's been interacting with more political work more generally. Well, I am aware of a couple organizations that work with refugees, one specifically from Arab countries, and another that's more general. Access is a large Arab nonprofit here in Dearborn, the Metro Detroit area, and they do work with recent Arab refugees and immigrants, who helping them find work, get loans, for housing, for businesses, that kind of thing. And in addition to that, there is a Freedom House, which is in Detroit, and that is a it's a home for refugees from all around the world, helping them get settled in the country, where they receive job training and housing and language skills and things like that. I actually used to I taught a screen printing class to Freedom House guests through the YMCA of Detroit as a vocational experience. One of their guests went on to become the printmaker for the YMCA, and he would make custom t-shirts and stuff like that for them. So, but given the large Arab population in the area, I think Access acts as the sort of organization that serves refugees, and they may have other organizations. I'm not aware of them. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Harms.
You're welcome. Okay, we have one other question from Debbie here. She's asked, for Lubna, based on the different immigration status of those who arrive, in your experience, did you find that aid or relief were able to serve everybody, or only particular statuses that some have? Also curious if anti-Blackness plays a factor in service provision or relief.
Hi, Debbie. Okay. Yes. So I want to start with the anti-Blackness question. Yes, I think anti-Blackness plays a huge role. One, because I think that there is very little attention paid to the fact that climate change, war, imperialism, poverty, and dictatorship has created one of the largest migrant refugee populations from Central Africa. And it's not just a migrant or refugee population that's headed northward towards Europe. It's also a population that is languishing in borderlands in Latin America, and even at the US-Mexico borderlands, a population who has really been kind of like completely invisible from being thought of as a refugee or migrant population for the last 30 years. They are now being considered, like there's a little bit more attention being paid to what's been happening through Central America and North Africa, Central Africa and North Africa over the last 30 years, because there's also other refugee populations at a much larger scale caused by much more overt wars. But if you look at some of I find there to be there's some complexity with the question of anti-Blackness, because there's a lot of parallels about the way that the refugee population is contained in Greece and in Europe that parallels the ways that state anti-Blackness violence happens here in the United States. So the moral panics around, oh my God, these people are coming, they're morally bankrupt, they're stealing our services, stealing our jobs, our wealth, like we don't have space for them, we don't have this and that kind of panic happening in Europe that's amplifying increased militarism of the borders and policing and police repression is something that we've seen for that this country was founded on, right? Like the containment of human populations, the policing, enslavement, and imprisonment of human populations. So there is a parallel between, I feel like, the carceral system here in the United States, the carceral system that is expanding because of the quote unquote refugee crisis in Europe today. But the other thing is that there's also this parallel around the question of property that I find really interesting. So during the protests in Ferguson and Baltimore, all these other places, there was this huge outcry about the quote unquote property that was being destroyed, the looting that was happening at stores, right? And I think that that's a very similar narrative to what's happening in Greece, specifically when it comes to the narrative, like the right-wing narrative about refugees squatting, taking over this property. So there seems to be this like ability to place the value of human life as less important than the value of property, which I think is something that's deeply been tied to anti-Blackness. Not to use that happening in the refugee context in Europe as a stand-in for how it operates in the United States, but I think there's some parallels, and I also think there's some particularities. And I think that in terms of the differential treatment between the different populations who were coming in to Greece last year. So, okay, so just a quick sort of recap. So in the camp that I was in Lesvos, the island of Lesvos in Moria camp. the way that it worked is that there would be several boats a day of various refugees coming to the shores. There'd be buses at the shores that would then drive them to the different refugee camps. And there was a couple different refugee camps, and they would place certain ethnic groups with each other, right? So there's, from the very, very beginning there, when they arrive to the shores, there's already sort of a national separation between these groups. Arabs go here, Afghans go here. If we don't have enough space here, then we'll send them here. Once they get to the camps, they have separate entrances for the different nationalities so that the Greek authorities, with their private security company that they have, that they've employed, can determine whether or not the person is eligible for a registration card. The registration card is a verification by the Greek authorities or by EASO, which is the European Asylum Services Offices now, that you are coming from a country that is legally classified as a refugee. Back then, before the EU-Turkey deal, if you had that registration card, you were then able to go to downtown Mytilene, which is the city of Lesbos, and purchase the ferry ticket to go to Athens. And in Athens, you would catch a bus and go up to the Macedonian border through Macedonia and make your way towards Germany, which is the last country at that time still accepting refugees. However, if you did not come from one of the countries that was classified as a refugee country, so those countries were Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, right? It was just 4 countries. Then you were not eligible for a registration card in order to continue your route. And so what would happen was many of these refugees would just spend days, weeks, months in Greece trying to figure out a way to get money transferred to them, to work to make money in order to buy like counterfeit passports or registration cards, right? So they knew they weren't going to be leaving Greece. They know they're not going to be going back to Turkey. So it's kind of like this place that they arrive where there's no way of going back in the way they came, and there's no way of moving forward except for sort of working through the system. So they would wait till they got enough money to buy counterfeit passports, and there's a huge industry of that. Some people are more fortunate to have the money to be able to do that than others. But yeah, so that's just sort of like the asylum or the transit process of how it functioned then. Now Afghanistan isn't even on the refugee country list, like even including the recent mother of all bombs that's been dropped on Afghanistan. Afghans are not eligible for refugee status upon first arrival to European countries. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, yes, they get treated differently in terms of services. So once you have your registration card, that is basically like your golden ticket in the refugee camp to get placed into a dorm or an IKEA house. And when during the weeks or the days where the camp is very full and there's no place, that is your ticket to be able to go and get access blankets or sleeping bags or a tent to camp outside. If you do not have a registration card because you're not legally classified as a refugee, you do not have access to any of those things. So you kind of rely on some people being generous and sharing his tent with you. But if you lucked out and you didn't have someone to help you with that day, you might be sleeping in a snow-topped mountain, literally just completely without a tent or a blanket because you couldn't have access to it. That's how it was back then. I think things have changed now, but definitely through the sort of big nonprofit organizations or the big international organizations, there is a hierarchy that is established based on racial, national lines that gets sort of coded as the legal classification of a migrant versus a refugee. And then that politics of scarcity of who has access to resources and who doesn't, it creates a lot of tensions between the groups, all of whom are really suffering and struggling, you know? So it turns into like, why does that person get food before I got the food? They're not coming from a refugee country, I am. And then you'll see these fights break out, right? Because it's a lot of desperation and misery. And I think that it's built structurally. And I believe it's built intentionally. I mean, there's very, very arbitrary definitions of who gets classified as a refugee and who doesn't.
Wow. Thank you, Lubna. Again, and thank you, everyone. This is recorded, so it'll be posted, and I'm going to watch it again because I'm busy over here trying to make sure I get everyone's questions in. I'd like to listen more thoroughly to the things you had to say because they are important, and this is happening right now. And these are ways that we can make it better, more bearable, and hopefully one day prevent it from happening. So to that end, I want to thank all the panelists, Lubna, Vanessa, Ali, all the organizations, PYM, ITC, WRL, and the organizations that you've worked with during your time there. Thank you all to the viewers for your questions, for your presence. And finally, just a final thank you to WRL for bringing everyone together. As a final plug, War Resisters is a grassroots funded organization, so support of any kind is appreciated. And you can learn more about that at warresisters.org/become-member. So with that, I will sign off unless there's anything else from panelists. No?
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Until next